On the morning of June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip ate breakfast in Sarajevo and prepared to assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was not alone. 5 other men were stationed along the route the Archduke's motorcade would take through the city. They had pistols and grenades. They had a plan. They had spent months preparing. By mid-morning, every single one of them had failed. The Archduke was alive. The mission was over. Princip walked to a delicatessen on Franz Joseph Street, a few blocks from the Latin Bridge, and bought something to eat. And then the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn. The car passed directly in front of where Princip was standing. It stalled. The driver, confused, stopped to reverse. The Archduke of Austria Este, Inspector General of the Austro-Hungarian Armed Forces and heir to one of the most powerful thrones in Europe, sat motionless in an open car approximately 5 feet away from the man who had been trying to kill him all morning. Princip raised his pistol and fired twice. 17 million people would die as a result. To understand how a wrong turn on a cobblestone street in a mid-sized Balkan city ended with the deadliest war the world had ever seen, you have to picture Europe in the summer of 1914. The assassination did not cause the First World War the way a match causes a fire. It caused it the way a match causes an explosion, when the room is already full of gas. The room had been filling for decades. By 1914, the major European powers had divided themselves into 2 armed camps through a web of interlocking alliance treaties that were originally meant to prevent war through mutual deterrence, but that instead produced a rigid system of obligations. On one side was the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. On the other was the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Britain. Each treaty obligated its signatories to come to the defense of the others under specific circumstances. The exact conditions varied by treaty, and the language could be ambiguous, but the general architecture was clear. If Austria-Hungary went to war with Serbia, Russia would mobilize to defend Serbia. Germany would mobilize to defend Austria-Hungary. France would mobilize to honor its treaty with Russia, and Britain would be drawn in through its obligations to France and its guarantee of Belgian neutrality. This was a system of alliances that made local conflicts much more dangerous. The diplomats and generals who had built this system believed it would prevent war because no rational leader would start a conflict knowing it would immediately become a continental disaster. What they had actually built, however, was a mechanism that would transform any sufficiently serious local crisis into precisely that disaster. Once mobilizations and treaties began to trigger one another, the process moved automatically, and no single government could easily stop it. The Balkans had been producing serious local crises with some regularity for about 30 years. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled much of southeastern Europe for 4 centuries, had been in accelerating decline since the mid-19th century. As it retreated, it left behind newly independent nations with overlapping territorial claims, ethnic grievances, and competing great power patrons. Serbia wanted to unite all South Slavic peoples into a single state. Austria-Hungary, a multinational empire that contained large South Slavic populations of its own, saw that ambition as existentially threatening. Russia considered itself the patron and protector of Slavic peoples generally, and Serbian interests specifically. Germany backed Austria-Hungary as its most reliable ally. These tensions made the Balkans a perpetual powder keg. 2 Balkan wars in 1912 and 1913 reshuffled the map of southeastern Europe and left Serbia larger, more confident, and more aggressively nationalistic. Austria-Hungary watched Serbia's expansion with growing alarm. By the spring of 1914, the relationship between Vienna and Belgrade had reached a sustained crisis. Senior Austrian officials began to discuss privately whether a war to permanently diminish Serbian power might be preferable to the slow erosion of Austro-Hungarian authority in the region. The stage was set for a single incident, a single wrong turn to ignite a catastrophe that had been building for decades. Into this environment, on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand arrived in Sarajevo. Franz Ferdinand was 50 years old, the nephew of the elderly Emperor Franz Joseph, and heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne since the death of the emperor's son Rudolf in 1889. He was not a universally popular figure. Within the Austrian military establishment, he was considered difficult and temperamental, but he was also, quietly, one of the more moderate voices in Vienna on the question of how to handle the South Slav problem. He favored a federalist restructuring of the empire that would give Slavic populations more autonomy, a position that infuriated Serbian nationalists precisely because it would undercut their argument that South Slavs could only achieve self-determination outside Austria-Hungary. He had come to Sarajevo to observe Austro-Hungarian military maneuvers in Bosnia, which Austria-Hungary had formally annexed in 1908, a move that had outraged Serbian nationalists and contributed to the regional tensions that were still reverberating 6 years later. His wife Sophie, the Duchess of Hohenberg, was with him. The date, June 28th, was their wedding anniversary. It was also, not coincidentally, from the Serbian nationalist perspective, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when the Ottoman Empire had defeated the medieval Serbian kingdom, a date of enormous symbolic weight in Serbian national memory. The 6 young men waiting for him along the Apel Quay in Sarajevo that morning were members of a group called Young Bosnia, a loose nationalist organization with connections to a more secretive Serbian organization called the Black Hand, which had ties to Serbian military intelligence. Their goal was the assassination of Franz Ferdinand as a blow against Austro-Hungarian rule in Bosnia and a step towards South Slavic unification under Serbian leadership. The 6 assassins were positioned at intervals along the route the motorcade would take from the train station to City Hall. Each carried either a pistol or a grenade. The plan was straightforward. If the first man failed, the second would try, and so on down the line until one of them succeeded. The first man to have an opportunity was Muhammad Mehmed Basic, positioned near the Kumurja Bridge. The motorcade passed him at speed, and he did nothing. He later claimed the police standing nearby made him hesitate. He stepped back from the curb and let the cars go by. The second man was Nedeljko Kabrinović, stationed further along the Apel Quay near the Austro-Hungarian bank. When the Archduke's open touring car passed, Kabrinović pulled the pin on his grenade, knocked the detonating cap against a lamppost to arm it, and threw it directly at Franz Ferdinand's car. The Archduke, or possibly his bodyguard, saw it coming and raised an arm. The grenade bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and rolled under the following car in the motorcade. It exploded beneath that car, wounding 2 of the Archduke's aides and several bystanders in the street. The motorcade did not stop. The drivers accelerated towards City Hall. Kabrinović swallowed his cyanide capsule and jumped into the Miljacka River below the bridge. The cyanide was old and weak. It made him vomit, but did not kill him. The river was only a few inches deep. He was pulled out by police within minutes and arrested. The remaining 4 assassins, hearing the explosion and seeing the motorcade accelerate away, concluded that the attempt had failed and dispersed into the crowd. The mission, as far as all of them were concerned, was over. At City Hall, Franz Ferdinand was furious. He stood before the assembled Sarajevo dignitaries who were waiting to give him a formal welcome speech and interrupted the mayor's prepared remarks. He said he had come to Sarajevo and his people had been met with bombs. The mayor, who had not yet been informed of what had happened on the quay, continued reading from his prepared text. Franz Ferdinand eventually allowed the ceremony to proceed. After the reception, he decided he wanted to visit the officers who had been wounded in the grenade explosion. They had been taken to the hospital. The motorcade would need to take a different route than planned to reach it. This is where the machinery of catastrophe, having momentarily jammed, lurched back into motion. General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia who was riding in the lead car, gave instructions to the drivers that the motorcade should proceed along the Appel Quay and then turn onto Franz Joseph Street, rather than taking the original planned route through the city center. The change was communicated, but imperfectly. The driver of the lead car, Leopold Loschka, did not receive the new instructions clearly or did not understand them. When the motorcade reached the junction of the Appel Quay and Franz Joseph Street, Loika turned right onto Franz Joseph Street rather than continuing straight, which was the corrected route. Potiorek, realizing immediately that this was wrong, told Logica to stop and reverse. Logica put the car into reverse. The engine stalled. On the corner of Franz Joseph Street, approximately 5 feet from the Archduke's now stationary car, Gavrilo Princip was standing in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. He had been there for some time. After the failed morning attempt, he had wandered through the city center, despairing and purposeless, and had ended up at this particular corner at this particular moment for no reason more strategic than that it was where his feet had taken him. He looked up and saw Franz Ferdinand sitting in the open touring car. Later, Princip would say that he did not consciously decide to shoot. He raised the pistol and fired. The first shot hit Sophie in the abdomen. The second struck Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. The whole thing took perhaps 30 seconds. The car drove on. Sophie died before reaching the governor's residence. Franz Ferdinand died approximately an hour later, still sitting upright in the car, blood soaking his military uniform, still murmuring something that witnesses described as sounding like a repeated plea to Sophie to stay alive for their children. In a police station a short distance away, Gavrilo Princip was being questioned. He was 19 years old and 4 months short of the minimum age for the death penalty under Austro-Hungarian law. He would not be executed. The news reached Vienna, then Berlin, then the other European capitals within hours. The initial response in most places was shock, followed by a cautious assessment of what this meant. Franz Ferdinand had not been universally loved. The Emperor Franz Joseph, who had never been close to his nephew, received the news with what observers described as a composure that suggested something other than grief. The first question in every capital was the same: what would Austria-Hungary do? The answer took 5 weeks to become clear, and those 5 weeks constitute one of the most studied and argued over periods in modern history, because what happened during them was not inevitable. At multiple points, different decisions by different people could have contained the crisis. What actually happened was a cascade of decisions, each one made under pressure and with incomplete information, each one narrowing the range of options available to everyone else, until, by the first days of August 1914, the war that no one had fully intended had become the war that no one could prevent. The first major decision was Austria-Hungary's. Within the Austro-Hungarian government, the assassination was almost immediately identified as an opportunity. The evidence of Serbian government involvement in the plot was partial and disputed, then and now, but within Vienna the political conclusion was reached quickly. Serbia had to be punished, and punished severely enough to permanently reduce its ability to destabilize the empire's South Slav regions. The question was whether Germany would back Austria-Hungary if Russia intervened to defend Serbia. On July 5th and 6th, the German Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg gave Austria-Hungary what became known as the blank check, an assurance of unconditional German support for whatever action Vienna chose to take against Serbia. The German leadership appears to have calculated that Russia was not yet militarily ready for a major war and would back down rather than mobilize. This calculation was wrong. Armed with German backing, Austria-Hungary spent the following 3 weeks drafting an ultimatum to Serbia designed to be rejected. The ultimatum, delivered on July 23rd, demanded, among other things, that Austro-Hungarian officials be allowed to participate directly in Serbia's internal investigation of the assassination plot, a demand so clearly incompatible with Serbian sovereignty that even German officials privately acknowledged it was intended to produce a refusal rather than compliance. Serbia, to almost everyone's surprise, accepted nearly every point of the ultimatum. The one point it declined, the direct participation of Austrian officials in its internal investigation, was the one Vienna had decided was the irreducible minimum. Austria-Hungary declared it unsatisfactory and began moving toward war. Russia began to mobilize. Here, the mechanism of the alliance system engaged fully, and the quality of individual decision-making became largely irrelevant to the outcome, because the decisions that mattered most were no longer being made by individuals, but by the logic of military timetables that had been constructed years earlier and could not easily be interrupted once begun. Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, required Germany to knock France out of the war in the West within approximately 6 weeks before turning its full military force east against Russia. The plan had been built around the assumption that France and Russia would fight simultaneously, and that France could not be defeated quickly if Germany fought on 2 fronts from the beginning. Therefore, once Russia mobilized, Germany had to declare war on both Russia and France, and had to move immediately through Belgium to attack France from the north, where its defenses were weakest. Moving through Belgium meant violating Belgian neutrality. Belgian neutrality had been guaranteed by treaty in 1839, a treaty that Britain had signed. When German troops crossed into Belgium on August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, citing the Belgian neutrality guarantee as the legal basis. Within 6 weeks of 2 gunshots on a street corner in Sarajevo, every major European power was at war. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in November 1914. The Balkans, Africa, the Middle East, East Asia, the Pacific, and eventually the United States in 1917 were all drawn in. The war lasted 4 years, 3 months, and 2 weeks. When it ended on November 11, 1918, approximately 17 million people were dead, military and civilian. Another 20 million had been wounded. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919, accelerated by the movement of millions of troops across continents, killed between 50 and 100 million more. The 4 great empires that had dominated European politics in 1914, the Ottoman, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian, and the German, all ceased to exist before or shortly after the war's end. The map of Europe was redrawn at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 in ways that created new grievances, new minority populations inside new borders, and the conditions for a second and even more catastrophic world war 20 years later. Gavrilo Princip did not live to see any of it, or very little of it. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence available for a defendant under 20 years old under Austro-Hungarian law. He was sent to the Theresienstadt fortress in what is now the Czech Republic, where he was held in conditions harsh enough that his tuberculosis, which he had already been living with before the assassination, progressed rapidly. He lost an arm to the disease. He weighed 88 pounds at the time of his death. He died on April 28, 1918, 7 months before the war ended, at the age of 23. His trial testimony suggests a young man who believed in what he had done, but was not fully prepared for what it meant. He said he had not intended to kill Sophie, who had been an incidental victim of the second shot. He said he had no regrets about killing Franz Ferdinand. When asked about the war, he expressed some belief that his action had been a contribution to South Slavic liberation, but the evidence suggests he had not anticipated the scale of what followed, and that the full weight of it was not entirely clear to him even by the end of his imprisonment, given how cut off from outside information he was kept. The corner of Franz Joseph Street where he fired the 2 shots was renamed several times over the following century, reflecting successive changes in political authority over Sarajevo. Under Yugoslav communist rule, it was named after Princip and treated as a site of revolutionary heroism. After the Bosnian War of the 1990s, in a Sarajevo governed by a very different political establishment, the renaming was reversed. Today the street is called Franz Joseph Street again, the same name it had on the morning of June 28, 1914. There is a small museum at the site. The Latin Bridge, a few yards away, still stands. The question of what the assassination of Franz Ferdinand actually caused, as opposed to what it triggered, has occupied historians ever since. The more you study the July crisis of 1914, the harder it becomes to sustain the simple version of the story, the version where one man's 2 bullets started a world war. What the bullets actually did was light the fuse of a system that European leaders had spent decades constructing, and that was going to explode eventually, through some crisis or another. Whether or not Gavrilo Princip had been standing in front of Schiller's delicatessen that afternoon, eventually is not the same as inevitably, and that particular afternoon, with that particular driver taking that particular wrong turn at that particular moment, was not inevitable. It was contingent, accidental, the product of a miscommunicated instruction, and a stalled engine, and a 19-year-old boy who had given up and gone to buy something to eat. The war that followed was the result of structures, of alliance systems, and military timetables, and decades of accumulated grievance and imperial competition that made a major European conflict deeply likely by 1914. But the specific war, beginning on that specific date, in the specific sequence it followed, was the result of 2 minutes on a Sarajevo street corner that should not have happened and very nearly did not. This is the thing about contingency in history. The structures matter enormously. The underlying forces, the nationalism, the arms races, the imperial rivalries, they shape what is possible and what is probable. But within the space of what is probable, the specific outcome is determined by the accidental, the personal, the random. A driver who took a wrong turn, an engine that stalled, a young man who happened to be standing on the right corner at the wrong moment. 17 million people, 2 shots, 1 wrong turn. Subscribe. If you want more stories about the moments where history turned on something that small,